They weren't defeated by the Japanese. They were abandoned by their own people. On the night of August 9, 1942, 11,000 Marines woke up to find the American fleet had vanished. There was no warning, no farewell. Just an empty sea where warships had stretched as far as the eye could see the day before. Those ships took everything with them: food, ammo, barbed wire, heavy gear. Everything a unit needs to hold an island surrounded by the enemy. What remained? 37 days of food, 4 days of bullets, no air support. And an enemy that hadn't lost a single major ground battle since this war began. Washington had already written the island off. The Navy had sailed away. Every military prediction pointed to one outcome. Guadalcanal was already lost. General Alexander Vandegrift stood on that beach, staring at the empty horizon. Then he turned his back on it. He opened his maps, and the choice he made in the next 6 hours would force Japan to do something it had never done in this war: retreat. This is the story of that night, and the men who stayed behind. The greatest generation never asked for a parade, but they truly earned one. If you have family who served in any branch, in any war, please share their name in the comments below. Let's make sure their stories are never forgotten. To grasp why a small island, barely on any map, became so crucial, you have to understand Japan's position in the summer of 1942. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, they commanded territory almost as vast as the continental U.S. They held Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma. Now, they were building an airfield on a tiny jungle island in the Solomon Chain, an island called Guadalcanal. That airfield wasn't just for defense. It was intended as a weapon of offense. If Japan operated from Guadalcanal, their aircraft could directly target the vital supply lines running from the United States to Australia and New Zealand. Cutting those lines meant America would lose its only launch pad for a Pacific counterattack. Every plan to push back against Japan would be scrapped and require a complete rewrite. Tokyo knew this. Washington understood it as well. But the decision to counterattack was made so hastily, it was almost reckless. Planning took weeks, not months. The maps used by staff officers for the landings were literally cut from a National Geographic magazine. There were no proper aerial photos of the area. No dependable intel on the terrain, the weather, or the actual number of Japanese troops on the island. This is what Washington gave Vandegrift: an underprepared mission on an uncharted island with troops who hadn't finished their training. Vandegrift knew all of this. He accepted the orders without complaint, because he was the kind of general who understood something many in Washington didn't. Japanese ground forces in the Pacific had not yet suffered a major defeat. Waiting until everything was perfectly ready meant waiting until it was simply too late. On August 7, 1942, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal's beach. They captured the airfield in just 1 day. The Japanese defenders, mostly construction workers and a small naval security force, fled into the jungle. They left behind their equipment, their food supplies, their construction machinery. Everything was still neatly arranged. Vandegrift believed the toughest part was over. He was mistaken. On the morning of August 7th, the Marines came ashore under naval bombardment from ships offshore. They were ready for a fight. It never materialized. The Japanese on the island, primarily builders and a small naval guard unit, escaped into the jungle. They abandoned everything: construction equipment, sacks of rice, canned goods. Even cases of Japanese beer were still stacked in a storage shed. By the end of that day, the Marines controlled the unfinished airfield. Vandegrift sent a report back to headquarters: progress better than anticipated. No one knew that was the last peaceful moment the campaign would ever experience. That very same night, a few hundred miles to the north, Admiral Gunichi Mikawa was steering a task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer at full speed toward Guadalcanal. He had a clear objective. In the early hours of August 9th, Mikawa's fleet entered Savo Sound under complete darkness. Radar was unnecessary. The Japanese had spent years perfecting this skill: night surface combat. Meanwhile, the American Navy had never prioritized this type of engagement. What followed took less than 40 minutes. Four Allied cruisers sank to the bottom: USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian cruiser Canberra. Over 1,000 sailors lost their lives. It was the worst open-sea defeat in the entire history of the United States Navy. And it happened while the Marines on the island were sound asleep. Mikawa surveyed the scene. The path forward was completely clear. American transport ships sat offshore, laden with food, ammunition, and equipment. Nothing remained to defend them. He could have ended it all right then, but he didn't. Mikawa was concerned about potential air attacks once daylight arrived. He turned his fleet around and headed back towards Rabaul. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his days, because those transport ships, though later ordered away by Turner, had managed to unload just enough supplies to sustain the Marines through the initial months of the campaign. If Mikawa had destroyed them that night, Guadalcanal might have ended before it even truly began. Admiral Turner received news of the Savo disaster just before dawn. He ran the numbers. The escort fleet was effectively gone. Admiral Fletcher had already withdrawn his carriers. Fletcher was wary of losses and departed without proper notification. No air cover, no naval shield. Turner made his critical decision. All remaining transports ordered to leave. Immediately, under the cover of darkness. No one informed Van de Grift before those ships weighed anchor. When the sun rose on August 9th, a Marine scout rushed to find Van de Grift. He stepped outside and gazed towards the water. An empty horizon, not a single ship in sight. Van de Grift later wrote in his memoirs that it was the moment he felt utterly abandoned. Not by the enemy, by his own navy. But he didn't write that down at the time. Instead, he simply walked back into his tent, gathered his staff officers, and got to work. The staff meeting was calm. No one panicked. No one raised their voice. Just officers sitting around a field table, examining numbers on paper, and fully understanding their dire situation. Van de Grift requested a straightforward assessment, no downplaying, no false hope. The findings: 4 days' worth of ammunition at full combat intensity. They had food for about 37 days if they started rationing right away. There wasn't enough barbed wire to secure the entire defensive perimeter. No artillery support, no air support, and somewhere out there in the dark, an enemy was already making its way towards them. 11,000 men were stationed on an island that was 90 miles long. There was no way to escape. 2 options were presented. Option 1 involved pulling back. The plan was to gather the entire force into a compact defensive circle around the beach. They would dig in, set up the wire, and wait for reinforcements to arrive. The choice recommended by every military textbook when you're cut off and running low on supplies. The one tactic every military guide advises when you're surrounded and your resources are dwindling. Option 2. Finish building the airfield. Not focusing on defense. Not just waiting around. Instead, they would build the one thing that could completely change the situation. A usable runway. With an airfield in place, they could get aircraft there. With aircraft, the Marines could establish their own air cover. There would be no need to wait for the Navy to return. But completing the airfield meant moving men outside the defensive perimeter. This would spread their forces too thin. It meant accepting the risk of being attacked before they were fully prepared. If the Japanese attacked before the airfield was finished, they had no backup plan. Van de Grift studied the map for a considerable time. Then, he pointed to the airfield location. That decision wasn't made out of pure boldness. It stemmed from understanding what Option 1 didn't explicitly state. Retreating and waiting would simply be a slower way to perish. Without the airfield, there would be nothing left to defend, nothing worth resupplying, and no compelling reason for Washington to risk sending warships all the way there. The Navy wouldn't come back for just a beach. They might come back for an airfield. The airfield was the sole justification for holding Guadalcanal. So they had to finish it. The following morning, while one segment of the force dug defensive positions, the rest grabbed their shovels and began working on the runway, under a tropical sun that reached 100 degrees by mid-morning. They wore uniforms that were already soaked through before 8 o'clock, and they started with half rations on that very first day. Most of them didn't entirely grasp what they were constructing. They simply knew their general had given the command. And so they worked. August 18, 1942. 11 days after the Navy had departed, a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over Guadalcanal and captured photographs. The runway was completed. The pilot was unable to comprehend what he was observing. Just 11 days prior, this location had been an unfinished construction site in the middle of the jungle. Now it was a functional airstrip, built entirely by hand, utilizing equipment that the Japanese had left behind, by men who were eating only 2 meals a day in 100-degree heat. Van de Grift gave it the name Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who tragically lost his life at Midway just 2 months earlier. The very next day, 19 aircraft touched down on Henderson Field. Wildcats, Dauntless, older planes, some planes patched together. Not America's absolute best, but they were present on the island under Marine control. Guadalcanal now possessed air cover. Those pilots referred to themselves as the Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's Allied code name. There was absolutely nothing glamorous about it. They slept in foxholes right next to the runway because tents couldn't withstand the bombing. They flew 3, sometimes 4 missions a day. Take off, intercept enemy aircraft, land, refuel, and then take off again. Between their combat flights, they would lie down beneath the wings of their planes to rest, still in their sweat-drenched flight suits. Fuel was supplied from drums on the ground, and some was even pumped from sunken ships lying offshore. When a plane sustained enough damage to be permanently grounded, the mechanics would salvage every usable part and attach it to another aircraft. Nothing went to waste. On some mornings, a pilot would walk out to his aircraft, not entirely certain how many other planes it had been put together from. Yet they flew regardless. 900 miles to the north, in Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto studied the intelligence report and immediately grasped the core issue. Henderson Field was far more than just an airstrip. It represented a significant trap. Any naval fleet that dared to approach Guadalcanal during daylight hours would fall within the strike range of aircraft operating from Henderson. Japanese ships could only navigate those waters at night, which was sufficient for bombarding the island and landing troops, but not enough to recapture it. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. He then ordered a ground assault to retake the airfield, deploying some of his most elite units, confident that a single, decisive push would overwhelm Henderson Field before it became too heavily fortified to breach. He profoundly underestimated how quickly Van de Grift had established his defensive lines, and he completely underestimated the men who would defend them. Colonel Kainoi Chiki arrived at Guadalcanal with 900 of Japan's finest soldiers and an unwavering conviction about how events would unfold. He felt no need for reconnaissance, no need for artillery preparation, and certainly no need for a contingency plan. He had Japanese soldiers, and for him that was more than enough. On the night of August 21st, Ichiki led his men in a direct assault along the beach east of Henderson Field. The tactics were straightforward, almost dismissive in their simplicity. Drive straight into the Marine lines at midnight, utilize speed and bayonets to break through before dawn. This strategy had proven successful in China, in Malaya, and in the Philippines. But it failed here. The Marines were prepared and waiting. Barbed wire brought the initial wave to a complete halt at the bank of the Ilu River. Machine guns opened fire from both flanks of the position. Within mere minutes, the white sand was stained red. Ichiki dispatched a second wave, then a third wave. Each successive wave was shattered against the wire defenses. When daylight broke, Van de Grift deployed tanks and a full battalion to move behind what remained of Ichiki's annihilated force. There was no avenue for escape. Nowhere left to go. 800 out of Ichiki's 900 men perished on that beach. Ichiki burned his regimental colors. Then he took his own life. This marked the very first time during the war that Japanese infantry launched an assault on a well-defended American position and were completely annihilated. They weren't just pushed back or repelled. They were utterly wiped out. Van de Grift didn't celebrate this. He understood that Ichiki's force was merely the initial wave. His premonition was correct. In September, General Kawaguchi arrived with almost 3,000 soldiers, a force 3 times larger than what Ichiki had commanded. And he wasn't planning to simply charge directly. Up the beach, Kawaguchi had clearly learned from the previous attempt. He guided his troops through the dense jungle, traversing terrain that Van de Grift had previously thought was utterly impassable, and set his sights directly on the elevated terrain south of Henderson Field, a narrow geographical feature that would later become known as Edson's Ridge. If you control that high ground, you control the airfield. If you lose it, you lose absolutely everything. During the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi launched his attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's defensive line, comprised of fewer than 800 men, managed to hold off nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers throughout the entire night. By 3 in the morning, the defensive perimeter had been compressed to an area less than 100 yards wide. Some defensive strongholds had already fallen. Japanese soldiers had successfully penetrated the barbed wire defenses. Edson moved along the line, maintaining his composure without raising his voice, making direct eye contact with every soldier he passed. This is the moment. There's no finer place to perish. The defensive line held firm. Van de Grift received the urgent update at 3:30 in the morning. The perimeter was still holding, just barely. He reviewed the roster of available reserve units. Only 1 battalion remained. If he deployed that final battalion, and the line still collapsed, there would be absolutely nothing left to safeguard. Henderson Field. Nothing left to save Guadalcanal. He gave the order to commit the battalion. By the time dawn broke on September 14th, Kawaguchi was retreating with the remnants of his force back into the jungle. Over 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead on that hillside. Henderson Field remained standing. Van de Grift finally sat down and, for the first time in weeks, exhaled a prolonged sigh of relief. But he was acutely aware of the grave implications of this victory. He had just expended his very last reserve units. If Japan were to launch another assault with a similarly sized force, he would have no remaining assets to defend against them. Second Lieutenant Roy Elrod arrived on Guadalcanal in November 1942, weighing 190 pounds. He departed, weighing 165 pounds. A loss of 25 pounds in just a few weeks. This wasn't due to a lack of effort. It was due to a lack of food. That was the grim reality on Guadalcanal following the major engagements. Not from artillery barrages, not from nighttime assaults, but simply the island itself wearing down the men, day after day, in its own silent, relentless manner. At night, the Tokyo Express made its runs. Japan couldn't transport troops during daylight hours. Henderson Field commanded the skies, but the darkness belonged to them. Japanese destroyers sped down the waterway the Marines referred to as the Slot, New Georgia Sound, at maximum speed, unloading troops and supplies onto the beaches before sunrise, disappearing before the Cactus Air Force could intercept them. They came every single night. Every morning, Van de Grift would examine the map, knowing that more Japanese soldiers had just come ashore. There was no feasible way to intercept them under the cover of darkness. Within the jungle, disease was claiming the lives of more Marines than Japanese bullets. By the time the 1st Marine Division was finally rotated out in December 1942, over 8,000 of its personnel had contracted malaria. Tropical illnesses had removed 2 out of every 3 men from the front lines, while enemy combat accounted for only 1 in 3. Casualties. Elrod recalled one evening, sitting on a wooden crate in the relentless downpour, shivering violently with malaria, experiencing severe dysentery, with Japanese mortar rounds impacting nearby, and mosquitoes swarming everywhere. He gazed up at the sky and thought, "I wonder why they can't land one of those rounds right here where it would actually be useful." That wasn't a man yearning for death. That was a man who had reached his absolute breaking point and was still holding his ground, still maintaining his position, because there was nowhere else he could possibly go. The orders had been explicit. Unless your fever exceeded 104 degrees Fahrenheit, you were not permitted to leave your post for the medical station. Van der Grift was fully aware of every single one of these circumstances. He personally visited the forward positions daily, observing the gaunt, hollowed-out faces of the soldiers, uniforms hanging loosely on men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He refrained from informing them that reinforcements were en route, because he harbored significant doubts as to whether they would actually arrive. He dispatched a cable to Washington, not requesting an evacuation, nor lodging any complaints, simply relaying the factual situation, so that if they were unable to maintain their hold, Washington would comprehend the reasons. The cable went unanswered for days. The soldiers who had been on the island the longest were subsisting on whatever the jungle provided: taro root, lizard meat, and rice scavenged from deceased Japanese soldiers. These were the very same individuals who had achieved victory at the Tenaru River, who had successfully defended Edson's Ridge, who had constructed Henderson Field with their own bare hands. Now they were consuming their enemy's provisions simply to endure one more day. And not a single one of them uttered a word about surrendering. While the Marines were clinging on by the thinnest of margins, a different kind of struggle was unfolding that neither side fully grasped at that moment. Japan was being depleted, not necessarily in terms of troop numbers, although the ground losses were substantial, but in something far more difficult to replace. Over the skies of Guadalcanal, Japan's most highly skilled aviators were being lost mission after mission. These were not just any pilots. They were the individuals who had undergone years of training prior to the war, who had flown combat missions over China and Burma, who had participated in the attacks on Pearl Harbor and Midway. Japan had dedicated an entire decade to cultivating this elite corps of aviators. They could not be replenished within a matter of months. Their replacement would take years, if it was even possible. Every day that the Cactus Air Force scrambled to defend Henderson Field, it was engaging in a critical exchange, pitting hastily repaired Wildcats and weary young pilots against Japan's irreplaceable veteran airmen, and Japan was suffering significant losses in this critical exchange. By the conclusion of the campaign, Japan had lost over 600 aircraft in the vicinity of Guadalcanal. More significantly, the seasoned crews who had provided those aircraft with their combat superiority were no longer in service. Yamamoto grasped the full magnitude of this situation better than anyone in Tokyo. He had witnessed Japan's naval air power, painstakingly built over a decade, tested at Pearl Harbor and Midway, being systematically decimated over a rudimentary jungle airstrip in the Solomon Islands. He understood what the inevitable consequences would be. Japan was still capable of fighting. But the nature of the conflict they could engage in during 1943 was fundamentally different from the war they had initiated in 1941. Their offensive momentum had evaporated. The experienced aviators were gone forever. The margin for error had been reduced to virtually nothing, all because the soldiers on that island resolutely refused to abandon their positions. On October 18, 1942, a significant message reached the officers stationed on Guadalcanal. Admiral Gormley had been relieved of his command. His successor, Admiral William Halsey. Upon reading this, the Marines exchanged glances and, for the first time in weeks, let out a shared laugh. Not because Halsey promised immediate relief, nor because everything was expected to transform overnight, but because that name signified that Washington had finally grasped the core issue. Guadalcanal was not a battlefield for passive defense. It required a commander willing to aggressively confront the enemy. Halsey was that commander. Consequently, supplies began to arrive with a more consistent frequency. The commander who stepped in to take his place, Admiral William Halsey. The Marines saw that message and, for the first time in a long while, they actually chuckled. It wasn't because Halsey delivered immediate rescue, or because everything instantly got better, but because that name signaled that command in Washington had finally grasped the situation. Guadalcanal wasn't meant for just sitting back. It required someone ready to go to battle. Halsey was ready to battle, and so, provisions began to arrive more consistently. More troops arrived. The Cactus Air Force got some new aircraft. For the very first time since August, Van de Grift could look at his map without having to figure out how many days he had left. But here's something history often leaves out. Halsey got there on October 18th, the Battle of the Tenaru. Marines were victorious. Edson's Ridge, Marines held their ground. Henderson Field, it was finished and operational. All of that actually happened before Halsey ever showed up. Van de Grift had been holding Guadalcanal for 11 whole weeks. No Navy support, no dependable supply route, no clear instructions other than a simple 2 words, hold on. Halsey didn't actually save Guadalcanal. He took over an island Van de Grift had already managed to keep together with just his bare hands and then successfully led it to the final win. In December of 1942, the 1st Marine Division was taken off the island. The soldiers who could still walk made their way to the shore on their own. The ones who couldn't walk were carried. Over 8,000 of them were suffering from malaria. Most had lost at least 20 pounds or more. Their uniforms were too big for bodies that looked so different from just 4 months before. They took one last look back at the island as their ships sailed away. We don't know what any of them were thinking. But the island was still theirs to keep. In February 1943, Japan secretly moved its last 10,000 soldiers out of Guadalcanal over 3 nights in a row. The evacuation was carried out so flawlessly that American intelligence first thought it was a new attack. Once the truth came out, the fight for Guadalcanal was officially over. For the very first time in this war, Japan had given up land they had conquered. Not because they were outnumbered, not because they ran out of ammo, but because they encountered something their military couldn't handle: soldiers who were left behind and just refused to give up. Alexander Van de Grift never became a name everyone knew. No big movie about him, no famous photo with cool sunglasses and a pipe, no famous quote in history books that every student knows. He was simply the guy standing on a beach during the worst part of the war, watching the last boat sail away, and turning his back to that empty sea.